Greetings everyone. Today, I, Jigmet Dolker, on behalf of the Internet Society ISOC India Mumbai chapter, welcome you all to the 7th edition of our Women in Technology Leadership webinar series. We are thrilled to have you all for this exciting session focused on reimagining digital identity. As technology continues to evolve, so does the way we think about and manage our digital presence. Today, we'll explore these transformative concepts and their implications for leadership in the tech that digital identity becomes central to our online experiences, right? So, it is my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Miss Kaliya Young, and we are honored to have the opportunity to learn from you, ma'am, and we are eager to gain insights. Ms. Juisha Gandhi, Vice President of the Internet Society ISOC India Mumbai chapter, who will brief us more about our esteemed speaker.
Thank you, Jigmet. So today we have with us Ms. Kaliya Young. She is a public interest technologist, widely known as the Identity Woman. She graduated from the first cohort of the Masters of Science in Identity Management Security program at the University of Texas at Austin. She authored the comprehensive domains of identity framework, which later became a very well renowned book. She has also co authored the comprehensive guide to self sovereign identity. She has spent the last 20 years of her career focused on one thing: supporting the emergence of identity layer of the internet that works for so they can build thriving communities. In 2005, Ms. Kalia co-founded the Internet Identity Workshop to bring together technologists working on making this vision a reality. Over the past 19 years, IIW has significantly influenced global identity standards with the new decentralized identity protocols being adopted by entities such as European Union, US Customs, and the Immigration Services. We welcome you, ma'am, and we look forward to your insightful points in the session. Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here and share. I'm gonna, I said in the introduction, I co-founded the Internet Identity Workshop, and I'm gonna touch on OAuth and OpenID protocols that were invented in the first 10 years and sort of end the talk talking about the protocols for decentralized identity that we've created in the last 10 years. This is the outline of my talk. I'm going to start out by sharing a little bit about where we came, like how we got digital identity. Since I'm presenting to you the Mumbai chapter of ISOC, I thought I would contextualize Aadhaar. I spent 2 months in India as a U.S. India Public Interest Technology Fellow. Then I thought I would share the domains of identity, talk about decentralized identity standards, and finally share with all of you where you can participate in making them, because standards are a participatory co-production process and we need more people involved. So the very first computers, 2 of them here, the ENIAC and the Colossus, had no users at all. They had teams of programmers that programmed them. They did one thing. The ENIAC measured the trajectory of munitions, and the Colossus was about code breaking. Then in post-World War II computing, you started to have larger machines, and as they moved into the universities and into corporate settings, you began to see the development of users' accounts on those machines and messaging between different people who held accounts within those machines. So this was the first sort of digital identities to come about. Then with the emergence of the ARPANET and domain names, you started to have sort of proto-emails, the ability to send messages not only within the population of users touching one mainframe, but between different computers all hooked up to the same network. As, huh? Oh, okay. Thank you for letting me know. They are progressing on my screen. Let me stop sharing and try again. Thank you. Um, um, you see a blue screen? Can you see the ENIAC and Colossus? Okay, great. Thank you for helping me get back on the right track. It's super important. There's a lot of slides. Okay, ENIAC and Colossus, post-World War II computing, 1960s mainframes, ARPANET. Then you had the development of enterprise identity and access management systems with a protocol called LDAP that if you have an account in any large system at all, it's going to be held in an LDAP. These are protocols really to help enterprises manage their employees. SAML, Enterprise SSO, and Enterprise Federation had this three-party model where the company gave you an account. You use that account to go and log into various services and tools that the company had for you. Then in the early 90s, you had the emergence of the consumer internet. And these are early services in the United States, CompuServe, Prodigy, AOL, and they all had a username and password model where individuals got a username that was unique in the system and a password to go with it. And this is sort of Web 1 e-commerce as it progressed. And the same pattern proliferated in Web 2, right? You started to get more accounts and more services and just kept going. I know people who have well over 300 accounts. What we innovated at the Internet Identity Workshop was these two protocols that go together, OAuth, Open Authorization, and OpenID, where the user would go to the relying party. They would assert who their so-called identity provider was, whether it's Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, GitHub, etc. They'd go to the identity provider, get a token, be redirected to the identity provider. If the user was logged in and consented, they would be redirected to the relying party. So this was a big innovation. It meant you didn't have to have a new account at every service. You could reuse accounts from one service and another service. And it created this identity provider model, which has a lot of power, but it also is disintermediating. It means that you always have to interact with your identity provider to connect to other services. But it was better than the world we had before, which was a new account for every single service. Now I want to sort of shift over and explore Aadhaar. So India is vast. There are a lot of people and a lot of languages, and to understand digital identity, it's worthwhile understanding some of the colonial origins of identity practices, as well as what happened in the post-colonial context. And I highly recommend these two books if you want to dive deeper. Keith Breckenridge's The Biometric State and Taranganini's book, In Pursuit of Proof, A History of Identification Documents in India. And before Aadhaar, identity was primarily at the family level with a ration card system. And you also had other documents, like some folks had birth certificates and other things. And if you can sort of visualize underneath this is paper. So paper is the substrate in which identity information is communicated. Some sort of registrar issues a paper certificate to the individual, the subject of the certificate or their guardians. That paper certificate is then used at various places, and they might somehow check back to the original source, but usually they just believe the paper, right? So the receiver of the information and the issuer of the information are really linked by the document as the sort of source of truth that's moving between them. And I'm sharing this now because later on I'm going to reference it and sort of say, like, this is how paper-based systems work, and our digital identity systems should work this way too. I also recommend this book if you want to get into the ins and outs of the politics of this, of Aadhaar. But Nandan Nilekani was a quite charismatic leader. He was named as a member of the cabinet, but was not elected to parliament. And he began the Unique Identification Authority of India with a startup culture and really succeeded in creating a minimum viable identity for the country. And it has 4 required things: name, birth date, gender, address, and it collects 13 different biometrics. You're also could include a phone number, email address, and bank account information as well. This is the form that was involved. I'm sure many of you filled it out and went through this process. And as part of that process, biometrics are sent to a central repository. They're compared against all the other already enrolled people. And then if you are in fact unique in the system, a card is sent out to you with your number on it. They used market forces to drive enrollment. So they didn't sort of rely on building a network of government offices for enrollment. They got the private sector to buy equipment to go out into the field. And it was through this incentive process that they managed to reach close to full enrollment of everybody in the country. So it's really quite remarkable. And there are 5 different ways to do authentication with Aadhaar, meaning checking that you are you. So you can present your number and a biometric and get a yes/no answer back from the system. You can present your number and request a one-time password to your telephone number and get a yes/no answer. You can use multi-factor authentication. And they also used Aadhaar to do a KYC process. Somebody has scribbled on my screen. But I want to go back to the Aadhaar model fits into this identity provider model, where every time you assert your identity using the system, it phones home back to the identity provider, which is the Unique Identity Authority of India. And so it is it's just really important to keep that in mind when considering the system, that this model creates within it an inherent surveillance, so that just like when you log in with Google in the, using OAuth and OpenID to navigate the web, Google is seeing everywhere you go. When you do authentication in the Aadhaar system, the core back end of the system is seeing everywhere you use your number. The original vision was to have Aadhaar sort of be at the center of everything, both on government interactions and commercial sector interactions. again, this is a kind of vision of pervasive, all-seeing of all activities. Another thing that often isn't talked about that I discovered while I was researching in India is that many of the security researchers and nonprofit organizations who pointed out flaws in the system were subject to first incident reports and criminal investigations, and it basically stifled all dissent about the system. There are no security features on the cards, and photocopies of them sort of happen all over the place. Anyways, there are challenges. There's lots of good things about Aadhaar. It's universal, and because everyone has one, it's universally accepted, and the debate is polarized. And again, these are great resources if you want to dive in and learn more. Here's the crazy ecosystem map I built of the whole system. I can pull out the pieces. There's other presentations I've given online if people want to go in depth. But again, this is this model where you, the resident, have a relationship with the central identity provider, and in order to use that, you need to kind of go back to them. They're disintermediating you. Okay, that was a lot. I'm going to shift to talking about the domains of identity and contextualize Aadhaar within that. So identity is complex. It's much more complex than a government giving you an identity card. This is a diagram from Australian Post about the center is things that you do daily, and the very outer ring is things you do infrequently, but you use and do identity all the time in all aspects of your life. And there's just a lot of different personal ways to sort of splice and dice personal data. So identity is everyone and everywhere. And the question I brought to bear when I was working on this is, how do we actually think clearly about it and not get totally overwhelmed by it? What are all the different places that personally identifiable information ends up in databases? So this is where the domains come from. It's really supporting us thinking clearly about identity in reasonably sized chunks and sort of starting with this question. And the first domain is me and my identity. So individuals have been collecting information about themselves forever, doing personal journaling, tracking how much they ate, how far they walked, etc. And they did all of that on paper before we had digital computers. Now we have digital tools to do this. And the question is, how can individuals collect their own information and sort of be autonomous with it? That's one of the things we've been working at the Internet Identity Workshop. But you also have other organizations like Indie Webcamp and My Data as kind of archetypically trying to address this problem. So this is domain one. You have another domain, which is not everybody is capable of managing all of their own stuff. And in fact, children are too young to do it, and elders may have no longer have the skills to do it for themselves. So we have delegated identity, which is you are doing identity transactions and interactions on behalf of another person. And these two sources of data, your own self and someone acting on your behalf, are the source of data within the next 12 domains. I'm going to walk through them. You have government registration. So this is what happens with Aadhaar, is you go and get enrolled. And once you've completed that process, the government sends you an identification document. Often, once you have an identity system going, this process starts at birth. And a phenomena emerges as well with modern states and their processes for identifying people is it shapes the minds of the people who get identification documents. The first countries to really do this at scale, France, people didn't really think of themselves as French citizens until the state showed up and said, we're enrolling you. And now here's your piece of paper that says you are a French citizen. And it shaped the psychology of the people who live there. And there's a recursive relationship between modern states and individuals who are registered within them. That the process of getting the documents informs how people see themselves. Government transactions. So this is what happens when you present your Aadhaar number and in return you get services. And it is common. Then you have another class of institutions I lump together and call civil society, religious institution, educational institutions, healthcare, sports teams, professional associations. All of these groups are interacting with people over pretty long periods of time and have some sort of goal of good work together. So you register into these institutions and get identity cards as a student or a patient, member of a team, member of a union. And then you present those credentials and in return have services. You have a whole set of transactions with the commercial sector where you register, you get a loyalty number or a customer number, and then you return to the shop and you use those credentials to assert who you are. You get payment, you give a payment,
दुर्गा
and you get good services in
आपल्या सोकावते
return.
वगैरे येणे बळदे एक वखत
And
अरे मुखाओं सोका
finally,
वगैरह तक कालदर वाला है ये किसी पर
Sorry for the interruption. Mr. Raj, can you mute yourself? Kali, can you mute him? Because I'm not the host anymore.
I wish they had that co-host thing. He seems good now. Okay. Surveillance. There's voluntary known surveillance. So this is like you get some sort of healthcare monitoring device and it sends the information back to your doctor. You volunteered to do it, you understand what's happening, and it's helpful to you. There's involuntary known. This is like going through the security checkpoint at the airport. You don't really have a choice if you want to get on the airplane, but you 100% understand it's happening. And then you have involuntary and unknown. And this is the kind of surveillance that Edward Snowden uncovered in the United States with the NSA sort of scooping up all the phone metadata of everybody. And there's some in-between space, right? Like if you have a proper functioning court system, somebody knows that surveillance is happening, but not necessarily the subject. So it's called lawful intercept. But government surveillance isn't all bad either. We have surveys to track labor force participation. The census is a type of surveillance. So I don't want it to be seen as all negative, that there is a role for sort of understanding what's going on out in the world. You have civil society surveillance. So these institutions have video cameras in them tracking activity. They may also have like tracking beacons on their websites. So they are also in doing surveillance. The commercial sector is definitely into surveillance. They've got cameras in stores. They're watching how people move through them. They're potentially like linking, who knows, the face now with facial recognition, who is coming into the stores and when. They're definitely using tracking on websites. And then everybody's doing some kinds of surveillance as well. So I've just shared with you that you have these three core things. You have registration, transactions, and surveillance. And then this last column is where employment is. And so in the employment process, you give a lot of personal information when you register. You're given a job offer, hopefully. You enroll into the enterprise system, and you're given credentials to log in and potentially also arrive on site. And you do your job. You show up, present your credentials, do a work transaction, and in return, receive payment. And your employer is surveilling you. This is a kind of classic type of surveillance, Taylorism, which was developed by the folks who were running the Ford Motor Company to make the assembly lines very efficient. We're doing this. And so there you have it. You have those two domains I described at the beginning and this chart of 12 additional domains. And there's two more to go. You have the data broker industry. So the data broker industry is collecting public data. It's buying data from stores and other sources. It's compiling it into digital dossiers. And then it is selling it both to the government, the private sector, potentially even civil society organizations. And it's happening. And the thing about it is legal, which is in contrast to the next domain, which is the illicit market. So all of these databases collecting all of this information are all subject to attack, whether it's by government actors or by criminal actors, who are then taking potentially the data and putting it on to the dark net and receiving payment for it. So there you have it, the 16 domains of identity. I think these are very good for helping think about identity problems clearly, as I said. So if you are like considering an identity problem, one of the first things I would recommend is considering which domain is it in. And then once you know which domain or a couple domains it's in, go and find solutions for that particular domain area. Because deciding whether a government agent should collect biometrics at a border is a really different problem than how old is my kid so I can enroll them in soccer. Or whatever sport you want to play in India. It's probably cricket. But they're all identity problems, but they're not all in the same little space. We need to think about them broadly and differently because they're different challenges. Okay. So I've put a lot of information out there. I hope some of it has been helpful in terms of thinking about the problem space of identity and how we are solving it. And what I want to do is shift gears and talk about the future and the protocols that my community has developed over the last 10 years, and where if you're a young person looking for new opportunities and want to help us innovate, this is where I'd recommend you dive in and engage with us. So we've done some of this consideration already, but I'll continue, which is really focusing down on digital identifiers. How are they managed today? You have digital identifiers controlled in private namespaces. So this is when you have an account underneath a service, whether it's Facebook, Yahoo for email, Gmail, a LinkedIn account, a Twitter handle, any number of other accounts. Those are all private namespaces owned and controlled by the company that manages them. You are at the affect of the owner of the namespace. They can decide to terminate your account at any time, for any reason. They don't have to justify it. And often you can only communicate internal to that namespace. So you can direct message other Twitter users, but you can't direct message Instagram users, right? And of course, there's this exception of email, which is an open standard from the 1970s. So open standards for the win. You also have a choice to get identifiers in a globally managed registry. So you can get a domain name at ICANN, an IP address from IANA, a telephone number within the telephone number system that's ultimately managed by the ITUT. But these also have challenges. They're positives to them. They're broadly accessible. You do pay rent to keep your identifier. You're the affect of the governance of those namespaces. They are globally resolvable. They are the basis of global communications networks, but they have emerging security and fraud concerns. So they're pervasive and we don't really think about them, but they're globally controlled and you have to kind of align to get into those namespaces. So how are decentralized identifiers different? Any entity can create them using software they control, and there's an infinitely large namespace, meaning we're never going to run out of numbers. This is what a decentralized identifier looks like. Says it's a DID. It has a method name. There's 180 different methods and a method-specific identifier. Each DID comes with a public key and a private key that you keep private. And each DID has with it a JSON LD document describing the entity identified in the DID. So there is a DID for self-description, set of public keys for verification, the authentication protocols, meaning which algorithms you would use to challenge the owner of the DID to prove they are in control of the private key. A set of service endpoints. So where could you go and connect to or speak to the controller of that identifier? A timestamp for audit history and a signature for integrity. So here is an example of a DID document. You have the DID at the top, the public key material, the authentication method, which is an RSA signature, an endpoint, which is the service type, when it was created, updated, and a signature that is done using the private key associated with the public key listed in the DID. So you kind of know it's from the controller of that decentralized identifier that has control of the private key associated with the public key listed. So in the reality and spirit of decentralization, the DID standard doesn't define one DID, but a kind of minimum viable product for a DID method, and there's 180 of them. Each DID method specific spec defines the syntax for the method-specific identifier. Any important elements for that particular type of identifier, if you were making identifiers for like drones or supply chains, you might add additional fields that are required for your DID document. How you create, read, update, and delete a DID in the target system. Many decentralized identifiers are globally resolvable. Some DID methods anchor into public blockchains, and some into existing infrastructure like DID web anchors into existing DNS. You have work by organizations like the Decentralized Identity Foundation to build a universal resolver, and companies that are commercializing that product. So if you want to resolve a DID, you can. You just throw it in a universal resolver and it'll come back. Some DIDs are non-public. So these DIDs are just peer-to-peer, or they appear once and sort of vanish. So if you have short-lived one-time use credentials, you just use the public key. You don't need to create an identifier, a DID that anchors into a blockchain, for example. So DIDs are identifiers that are globally resolvable, decentralized, have associated public keys and endpoints, and that gives you something we have never had on the web before that's really innovative and super exciting, which is resolvable, decentralized public key infrastructure. So it's really quite a breakthrough. And it's essential to reset the foundation to get beyond private namespaces and globally managed registries as the only way to have your identifiers. Now, I just told you a lot about really long numbers, and who really cares? Most people don't. And that's fine, because the internet runs on really long numbers, but we need to do fun and interesting things with them. That's where verifiable credentials come in. So verifiable credentials are a way for one entity to say anything they want about another entity and do so in a cryptographically secure way. They follow this model where an issuer issues a verifiable credential, they give it to a holder, and the holder puts it in their digital wallet. The holder shows up at a verifier, and they present the information, present a presentation of the credential. The verifier does something important. They go and they look up the key material associated with the issuer, and they can run a calculation over what was presented and understand whether what was presented to them hadn't been changed, and if it really came from the issuer, the owner of the DID. U.S. government is looking at issuing permanent resident cards using this method, and this is sort of a verifiable credential in its raw format. You can see the issuer here, who's the issuer of a credential, the status of the credential, who the subject is, all the information about the cardholder, and where you can go get the public key information of the issuer to verify the digital signature. So it's an important way to digitize many of the documents that we currently store and use on paper or little plastic cards. It has very broad expressive capacity. Like I said, anyone can use it to say anything they want about another entity or person, and it has a huge range of use cases. I'm pleased to report that the folks who are working on MOSIP, which is the modular open source identity platform, have embraced this model. They have, there you can see, these are slides from their conference last March, really embraced verifiable credentials and have the NG wallet for decentralized credentials. So MOSIP is Inspired by the Aadhaar model, they are registering people into registries of citizens and residents. I often wonder why people get so upset about this, because every country in the Western liberal world has a registry of citizens. They all work slightly differently, but somebody has your photo and your name and your birthday and where you live in a government list. So that's different than every time I want to prove who I am, the government is in the middle of that transaction. And that's why it's really important and heartening to see that MOSIP's adopted this. They're talking about supporting issuers being able to issue these credentials, leveraging some of the existing infrastructure that they have to get credentials into individuals' wallets. There's always this problem, and it's sort of it's a place to consider, and the community talks a lot about this, is how do you actually know a credential is in fact about the person? So we call this subject holder binding. There's various different ways to do it that are listed here that are from how MOSIP's considering it, but every system has to figure this out. And there's also a really important feature that is being worked on, is how can I have a credential in my digital wallet and not share all of the information on it, just some of it. So this is called selective disclosure. And the paper that I think was linked to that I wrote about credential flavors goes into a lot of detail about how this is achieved. And there are a lot of formats. I looked at this slide when I was at the conference, and it was on this huge, huge screen. And I was like, oh my God, it's so many things. What they don't tell you is most of the people in most of these groups are also in the other groups. So it's really one group of people. It's not 6 different groups of people working on different things. So this is a little bit more about all the different pieces of the NG wallet that the MOSIP folks are working on. There's integration with the open CRVS system so that when a birth is registered, it can lead to the issuance of verifiable credentials for the paperwork. And then there's a question of how do you get these credentials into wallets and interact with them? In the beginning, there was a set of protocols called DIDCOM, and they leveraged DIDPeer to basically support using decentralized identifiers to build a secure tunnel to connect two people to wallets, so they can exchange messages, and those messages could include their verifiable credentials. Then you had work going on we talked about OpenID before, but OpenID has some existing protocols that help build secure communication tunnels between a potential issuer and a receiver of a credential and a potential verifier of a credential. So this OpenID for VC Suite has gotten a lot of attention because it leverages existing infrastructure and existing protocols that developers understand. So you can get a credential into your wallet, and you can share a verifiable presentation from your wallet using this. And then finally, some people were like, we like OpenID and DIDCOM. So there's OpenID DIDCOM if you want to get really advanced. But what that supports is sort of the initial issuance into one wallet and an ongoing communication tunnel between the holder and the issuer. So if you wanted to have a secure connection between you and your bank, you could use DIDCOM after you got the credentials into your wallet. And finally, you end up with challenges of decentralized trust and governance frameworks. How do you know which types of entities are in a registry? what their public keys are, the types of credentials they issue, how the registries govern, and what they agree to. Because if everything's decentralized, you have to have sources of information that's reliable for particular industries and sectors. So this is sort of putting the trust registry into the context of this issuer holder verifier model, where issuers would register their keys and information about what they issue into a trust registry, which would be governed. We have these already, we just don't use these words for it. So there are higher education certification bodies. That's an example of a trust registry, and it has a governing authority over, how it goes through the process of governing these systems. And then you need to figure out where these trust registries are. So my colleague Lucy in my consultancy is actually working on sort of building a directory of trust registries. This is currently a UNDP project. It's all open source, but it's supporting a network of different directories so we could actually find out things. And then finally, I wanted to just conclude by sort of making a connection back to the earlier presentation that I made, the earlier part of the presentation and this one, and sort of look at these shapes. So I talked about this OpenID and Aadhaar phone home model, where you have an identity provider, a relying party, and the user. And look at this shape. This is the shape of a decentralized identity system, right? With the issuer, the holder, and the verifier. And it looks quite similar to that paper-based model that I touched on in the beginning, right? They have a similarity. This paper-based model that is widely used in democracy does not look like the phone home model that the computer folks invented. And this is this key subtle point that I just want to leave you with, if you take nothing away, is that nothing else away from what I'm sharing is that these new decentralized identity models are aligned with how paper-based identity systems work. And that's a good thing. If we want to let people move about society freely and do their own transactions and not have the government in the middle of all of them. And if you want to get involved in the decentralized identity community and work, I recommend these places. There's a credentials community group in the W3C. They have an amazing collection. They meet every week and they have different presentations. And it's all posted online, so you can go sort of back through it and watch videos. The Decentralized Identity Foundation and the Trust Over IP Foundation. And finally, I wanted to conclude by sharing that the Internet Identity Workshop that we've hosted for 19 years, we're now expanding and doing regional events. And the one that's coming up closest to the folks in India is the APAC Digital Identity On Conference, which will be in Bangkok, Thailand in January. That's that's an example of an agenda wall from IIW. We co-create our agenda each day live at the event, and that is my information. And I see there's, I guess, are they questions up there or?
Oh, yes, there are questions. We can first take them
Great.
from the floor, and then we have some online as well, which I can read out to you.
Okay.
Yeah. Anybody with questions? Here. Narula?
Hello. Yes. Hello, ma'am. I just wanted to ask, like a little bit about DID, like how from the back end, like how it works. I just want to understand. Does it involve certain, like how do you actually build that? I just want to understand that one.
How do you build it? So different DID methods create their decentralized identifiers differently. The work was inspired in part by blockchain. So many of the DID methods involve creating an identifier and anchoring it into a blockchain. However, after all of that inspiration from blockchain, people were like, why do we need blockchains? Let's just create a decentralized identifier and post it on a web page. So that's where you have decentralized identifiers methods like did web. There's a new one called trusted did web that is a bit more sophisticated in how it works and with more provenance of the key material over time. But there isn't one way to create a decentralized identifier. There are many hundreds, and you can go and look at the registry and explore them. Does that help?
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.
Does anybody have questions here, or shall I just move on to the online portal?
I'll just quickly ask a question. You showed us like a really big slide with the different access formats from a workshop you had attended. Are there like certain identifiers or identifier formats which are better from an information security perspective? At tracking what users are doing. Yeah.
Yes, there is actually work that's happened in the community. There's a decentralized identifier rubric, which helps, which can help you think about how different DID methods are different, including, I believe, security features for them. So that's a place to start to look at. And I think it's just important to understand that decentralized identifiers are useful and sort of also inspired the creation of verifiable credentials, but the verifiable credentials work and the decentralized identifier work are separate. Like they're complementary, but they're two different protocols that do two really different things. So there's also a lot of work being done on the security features and challenges with verifiable credentials as well. So great. Let's go to the online forum.
Okay, thank you. So we have a lot of them actually. So one of them is, how does AI and deepfakes influence the digital identity security?
Great question. In fact, a white paper just came out this week about it. I'd recommend reading it. I haven't even, it's so new, I haven't had a chance to read it, but it's as soon as the AI story broke, I was like, oh, now we're in business, because as AI becomes more pervasive, the provenance of things and knowing where they came from, along with sort of knowing, is that a real person? They can be not solved, but verifiable credentials play a role in addressing this kind of trust challenge, right? So that for example, I have a verifiable credential issued to me by the state of California in my digital wallet that the state of California gave me where I live. And the state of California is not in the business of issuing driver's licenses to fake AI people, because only real people show up in their office and get their photo taken, right? So there is a way in which if I have that credential and I present it, it's probably a real person, because the state of California doesn't issue driver's licenses to fake people, because they can't, because you have to show up in the office and get your photo taken, right? So that's how AI potentially is, like, deep fakes can be addressed, is that they won't have real credentials from real entities.
Okay, thank you. Great. So the other question is, what ethical considerations should be taken into account when developing digital identity systems to prevent the exploitation or marginalization of women?
I guess there's a lot in that sentence or that question in terms of considering what exploitation and marginalization you're worried about. I think a lot of people who are advocating for more universal identity systems point to the fact that oftentimes women don't have the same access to identity documents that men do for cultural reasons. And also, women may also have, if they do have identity documents, they may be taken away from them, right? I think one of the powers that we have with digital credentials is you can't really take them away from people the same way, right? So it might be, clearly the paper-based systems for identity will still be around for several decades. And then maybe forever. I think they're a useful complementary substrate, and we need to still have them. But if you think about a human trafficking situation where people who are being trafficked need credentials to cross borders, but then those credentials get taken away from them. But there's a way in which you can't take a digital thing the same way you can take a paper-based thing. So maybe there's some things there. I think that type of question is a type of question we should have longer, bigger discussions about and make more space for. I know that people in my community care greatly about folks who are in difficult positions and at the margins. There's a whole white paper that's been written about the harms of digital identity and really getting at not so much like, oh my God, it's all bad, but just being like, there's a lot of things to think about when making these systems. And this paper does a really good job of sort of walking through a whole bunch of them. And I think, to me, the phone home architectures, if those became pervasive across the globe, that would be really worrying for women, because the state has no business seeing where you use your credentials. And if we built systems that are premised on the fact that every time I proved my identity using state issued documents, that the state could see that creates real risk. So I have spent my life energy trying to support these new, differently architected systems coming into being, because I don't want the government to be in the middle of all of our transactions. And I don't want giant corporations on the commercial side of things to be in the middle of all of our interactions in the digital world. I want us to have a locus of control and tooling that centers the individual, and then and then hopefully the individual in groups of their own choosing being able to self-organize and work together and not be controlled by either corporations or governments.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
It's a lot. Hopefully it wasn't too overwhelming, but
No, it was not. It was great.
great,
Yeah.
good.
Does anybody else have questions here? I don't see anything. So, Talia, thank you so much. Oh, ask one question. Oh, somebody said something. Sorry. Close it. Okay. So, okay. No, nothing. Sorry. So, thank you so much. It was a very very insightful and enlightening discussion. And we are truly grateful we had you today. I know it was really early for you in the morning, so thank you for that as well. And I would like to also express a deep gratitude to our incredible team of designers like Kushagra, Rupam, and Valentine, and our other volunteers, and all of the other people who have been instrumental in bringing this event to life. And also my fellow leaders like Juisha, Jigmet, um and a big shout out to Hiram. Like without him, this wouldn't have been possible. And to our advisors, of course, Pratik, Shweta, and Nanta. And lastly, to all those who have joined and participated today and asked questions. And thank you, everyone, for your amazing contributions and presence. And yeah, and Jolly, thank you so much for the live stream and the support. Like, he supports us every time. So, can we have a final round of a picture? And that'll be all.
Right.